My name is David Silver, owner of the Vintage Watch Company based in London's Burlington Arcade, the largest collection of vintage Rolex watches on display anywhere in the world.
今天呢，我们来到 David Silver 的 The Vintage Watch Company 这家非常知名的劳力士中古店，位于英国伦敦。
So today I welcome you all here to talk through the collection with me to understand everything about the Vintage Watch Company and the products that we sell. We are exclusively vintage Rolex, and I will go through the many periods that we cover from the very beginning, 1915, all the way through to the later 2000 models.
今天呢，我们要来看一下 David Silver 他非常棒的一些劳力士的收藏。我们在这儿呢，也能够感受到 David Silver 他非常强大的收藏，将近有3000多块的劳力士的这个经典和非常稀有的腕表。Okay, David, I really want to understand a little bit about Vintage Watch Company. Would you please give us a little bit of introduction?
Yeah, so the Vintage Watch Company is now 27 years old. For our 25th anniversary, I wrote a book exclusively on vintage Rolex, all the pieces that have come through my hands over the years. This is a family business. My father, myself and my sister, based in the Burlington Arcade, have been in the Burlington Arcade for over 18 years, and we are passionate about all things vintage Rolex.
Wow, that's really cool. 所以呢，其实 David Silver 他和他的父亲其实是整这家店在这个伦敦已经是非常多年的历史了，是1995年的时间就在伦敦开始了他们劳力士的这样子的一个历程。那么今天呢 ，David Silver 他会给我们展示很多的劳力士的收藏。And David, could you please actually showing all your favorite Rolex piece?
Yeah, I'll go through that. I think the important thing to firstly understand for the Chinese marketplace is what is vintage. What does vintage mean? How old is a vintage watch? So vintage is a term to explain that a watch is at least 20 or 30 years old. It is a watch that is no longer currently in production and cannot be found in any Rolex store in the world new. These are the older versions, the much rarer pieces. So everything that we have in this store is very special, very rare and unavailable to buy new.
Sometimes, like people asking us, like, is the vintage actually the same like a second hand? Do you think it's the same or not?
No, so second hand for us is a term that means the watch is currently available in a Rolex store today, but you have bought that watch 2 years old or 3 years old that has been owned by somebody else. Everything here, vintage, really means 20 years or older.
所以我们知道中古的劳力士其实它是有更久的历史的。如果说你觉得是劳力士是二手的，或者说是中古，它其实在不同的意义上呢，刚刚 David 呢也介绍了一下 what's the difference between vintage and second hand.
Anyway, let's start. Let's get some pieces out so you can understand visually what I'm talking about. Rolex as a company is originally formed in 1905 in London's Hatton Garden. A German watchmaker and an English investor by the name of Wilsdorf and Davis, and the early cases and early watches are all signed on the inside W and D. The first pieces to come out of Rolex are very much in the style of what we now call officers' watches. They were utilitarian watches made for officers in the First World War. So as war looms and the actual outbreak of war occurs, Rolex begin to make production watches for officers in the military, and these very early pieces are very much based on a pocket watch design.
So David, this is like a kind of like earliest Rolex.
This particular watch is from 1915, so it's extremely early, one of the first pieces made.
Wow. 这一块表是1915年的劳力士，非常的早，非常的棒。其实我们在David Silver 他的这个收藏店里面可以看到很多的珍藏。所以呢，很多人他会说David Silver 的 Vintage Watch Company 是伦敦的劳力士博物馆。
So before this period, any good gentleman, English or otherwise, wore pocket watches. So it is really only the First World War that made the necessity for a wristwatch, for people to be in the same place at the same time simultaneously, and the design is literally a round circular case very similar to an open face pocket watch with 2 lugs put on either end. After the First World War, import duties coming into the UK were extremely high, therefore Rolex do make the decision to move entirely to Switzerland. Prior to this point, the movements were always made in Switzerland but imported into the UK. So they had to, after the war in 1919, entirely move to Switzerland, and they never looked back. They now become globally the largest watch brand in the world. As you flick through the book, you can see all the early pieces photographed in the vintage section, and a quick snapshot of pieces from the 1920s, very much cushion in design, 1930s rectangular pieces, 40s again go to the squarer models, and then the 50s all have become about round pieces. Women's watches are all the time through this collection. Very early deco 20s and 30s pieces are exceptionally beautiful, studded with diamonds, and very, very elegant for evening wear. And then the next real feature from the 1950s is 1956, the introduction of the day-date model. That is where Rolex's collection changes dramatically. So the single most important event in Rolex's history is in 1926, the invention of the first waterproof watch. All watchmaking companies at the time were in this race to make an entirely waterproof case. Rolex wins that race, and in 1926 the Oyster is born. It has a unique screw-down crown, screw-down case lid, bezel, and case back. The watch is tested by Rolex on an Olympic swimmer named Mercedes Gleitz, who swims the channel, and when she arrives in France is still wearing a watch that is telling the absolute perfect time, hence the birth of the Oyster.
Thank you, David. David Silver 呢，刚刚给了我们非常棒的劳力士的历史介绍。那我现在呢，非常想知道 David Silver 他最喜欢的是哪一块劳力士手表啊？因为他是一个非常大的劳力士中古的收藏家。David, what's your favorite Rolex watch?
So my personal passion is the day-date. First made in 1956, it is later known as the President model. It has both the day and the date featured on the dial. It's made all the way through the 50s, 60s, into the 2000s, and is currently available, obviously still today in the collection. But my personal passion lies within the stellar dials, within the colourful pieces, highly jewelled watches. And in my book, which you can purchase, and we can show you links in where to get it, you will see so many different colours and variants of dials in these pieces, and I'm going to show you some now in front of us as well. So what I love so much about these pieces is the variety of colours, the variety of stones that were used in these pieces, the wearability of the watches. They're available in white gold, in platinum, in rose gold, in yellow gold, and they're basically completely unisex. They're wanted by women all over the world, men all over the world, and the size at 36mm is kind of perfect for everybody. This exceptionally rare piece, fully jeweled, diamond dial, diamond bezel, diamonds all the way through the bracelet, is obviously originally made for a man. The jing you can see on a female wrist.
Yeah, this is really beautiful.
It's really special.
The female.
All pieces in this period are entirely handmade, hand set by Rolex in the factory. So one thing very important to understand is that these watches are known as factory set models. They are set by Rolex and left the factory this way. They were not later adapted by anybody else.
非常非常棒的这个劳力士的腕表，虽然它之前是为这个男士来设计的，但是很多女士也非常喜欢啊，全都是这个钻石，还有一些稀有的珍贵的宝石。那我们也想知道哈，有很多人他到伦敦来旅行或者生活在英国伦敦，还有哪些劳力士的腕表非常感兴趣啊 ？David, so what else other people really want to see in your store?
I think the next most famous element of our store, the pieces that people travel the world and come and see, are the sport models, the most iconic of watches, the Daytona models, the GMTs, the Submariners, the Explorers. Our collection is unparalleled in that area. So Jing, if people come here and see me in store, they will be able to see very rare pieces like the Bakelite GMT, the first model of Pepsi bezel made.
Wow.
They'll see Submariners in similar period from the 1950s without the crown protection, made famous by Sean Connery in the James Bond movie Dr. No in 1962. And lastly, of course, no visit is complete without looking at Daytona models. The vintage Daytona pieces, first introduced by Rolex in 1963. We have those in the collection from the beginning all the way through to the mid-1980s.
So David, what do you find that people buy the most in your shop?
So the most popular present to yourself or otherwise in our store is a watch from your birth year, to buy a vintage Rolex watch as old as you, a watch made in the year that you were born.
那其实呢，在 David 店里面，很多人非常喜欢买的就是与他们同年出生的这个劳力士腕表，比如这一块。So David, could you tell me about a warranty if people buy the watches from your shop?
Yes. So every watch that we sell comes with an international 3-year warranty. We have our own workshop exclusively for our collection for the pieces that are sold here. We have 8 Rolex trained watchmakers entirely for ourselves. So anything sold by us internationally is warranted and can be repaired and sent backwards and forwards by FedEx if necessary in order for us to repair it for you.
非常棒，因为其实 David 呢，他的店在英国伦敦是非常知名的劳力士中古店，同时也有非常好的售后服务。所以 David Silver 的这家劳力士中古店 The Vintage Watch Company 也是许多人到英国伦敦来旅游，或者您住在英国必须探访的一家店。
Our presence now on Chinese social media is growing every day, and our platforms, we will give you the links below so you can follow. Also, please follow us on our YouTube channels as we explore more of these videos and go through the collection over the next few months.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.